Hello folks, the Y Guy here, and welcome to my home on this beautiful spring day. Snow is melting quickly, and please look me up on Facebook under the Y Guy, as well as Jonathan Jones, and the YouTube video, you know the routine, the thumbs up, thumbs down thingy, and subscribe thingy, and please be polite thingy. I'd really appreciate it if you leave comments. Be polite. The name of this video is called The Y Guy, Hard Evidence For and Against Hell. You notice I just didn't say evidence. I said hard evidence for and against hell. Now this is going to be part one. That's what this video is. It's going to be a two-parter. There's just too much information to cover in this one video. So what is the evidence for the existence of hell? What was the evidence that I used to use back in the day? That I believed in, that I promoted. So I know where people are coming from because I was there. Now the evidence that there was three main evidences that I would use for the existence of hell, for it. And I would say the Bible, was evidence, testimonies of people who say they've gone there, and then it's obvious the justice for the wrongs of mankind. You just have to turn on the news, that's what I would always say. I mean, there's got to be some justice about what's going on, So those are the three main ones. On this video, I'm only going to cover the Bible aspect, all right? Now, before I cross-examine the evidence for the existence of hell, before I cross-examine that, or for and against, I need to share a little bit of my background, all right? As a young man, and you'll understand why I have to share this. As a young man, I worked out on a horse ranch, lived and worked at a horse ranch in Colorado that was owned and operated by a deputy district attorney for Denver. And, around the dinner table, almost every night, at least 5 nights out of the week anyway, we would sit and talk about cases, all right? And because this district attorney wanted to get a better feel for the average person on the street, for the juror, how they would think. And that was a perfect opportunity that this DA had sitting around the dinner table. We would just discuss cases, not in specifics, but just in generalities, because there was a precedence that this DA had to follow. So anyway, after almost a couple of years of this, I began to understand how court proceedings happened. I knew the law. I knew it not as well as this DA, but I knew an awful lot. I couldn't quote you a chapter and verse in the law books, but boy, did I learn some stuff after a couple of years, 5 nights a week. We're talking a couple hours every night. You think I'd learn that? So anyway, well, it's because of my inquisitive nature, because that's just how I'm wired, and the questions that I would ask this DA as a potential juror, so to speak, this DA was intrigued. And I'm not tooting my own horn here. It's how I'm wired. This DA was intrigued and suggested that my career should be in law enforcement. All right? And to quote, "You have a good mind for this." That's what this DA would say to me all the time. Well, let's fast forward now to a few years later in a different state. An opening happened in that local police department. And myself, along with about 300 other applicants, went down. And we were required to take the state certified law exam. This was not the bar exam, okay? But it was basically for peace officers and the like. And out of 300, and it was supposed to be roughly a 2-hour exam. Well, I remember opening that. It was a stack of papers. I kid you not. It seemed like it was a half-inch thick. And I went through that thing, and I was almost snickering, chuckling to myself, going, "What? This is so stinking easy. I can't believe it." And I whipped through that 2-hour exam in 20 minutes. And at that point, I had never opened up a law book I didn't study for this exam. I knew it was coming up a month beforehand. I never once studied, did any research, didn't do anything. And I whipped through that thing in 20 minutes. And to the surprise of the orator's face, I went up to the desk and tossed that thing down 20 minutes later. And that orator looked at that body language, said, look at this idiot. Who's this idiot up coming up here turning this in, you know? Well, out of over 300 people, myself and 2 others were the only ones that passed that exam. All right, so that's just kind of give you just a sample of why I'm looking at this, doing this video this way as evidence. All right, now let's fast forward one more time, and to my wife's delight, I chose a completely different career. All right, and a lot of wives would understand her delight. Well, this is what I've learned, okay, through all of this and how I'm going to apply it to this video. The first and the foremost rule, okay, that was taught to me regarding any kind of a police interrogation or a cross-examination in a courtroom is keep your eyes and your ears open to any inconsistency in a testimony. Okay, that was the key. Oh, and for you who are viewing this video that might be in law enforcement or in law practices, comment, all right? Back me up on this one. Now, whenever there's a lack of consistency, the reason that's so important to keep an eye and ear open for any lack of consistency, whenever there is a lack of consistency or a story changes or something like that, it just simply means something is not true. All right? That you have to dig deeper and find the answers. And that's what this video is all about. Okay, now the second thing that a good interrogator or even an attorney or DA would do is to try to discredit, you know, the testimony of an opposing witness. That's the second rule, okay, that I learned. And I'm going to apply that as well for the evidence for the existence of hell. Now, keep all that in mind. Now, the YouTube courtroom is now in session. And let's proceed to examine what traditional Christianity has supplied as their evidence for the existence of hell. Now, the first one that I mentioned was the Christian testimony would be, it's in the Bible. It's the one I always used. All right, now let's look at that. I'm going to cross-examine that testimony now. It's in the Bible. The first question I would ask is, which Bible are you referring to? Do you remember that word inconsistency? Now, I got a list here that I'm going to read you. This is my evidence, my hard evidence of inconsistency. It's as follows. The Latin Vulgate, which is where most Bibles are translated from, hell was mentioned 111 times both in the Old and the New Testament. Okay? The King James, which was the Bible that followed that, 54 times. Hell was mentioned. What happened to all those hells? Now let's just go on to the New King James. Surely they would be the same as the King James. No, 32 times. The New International, 14 times. The Amplified, 13 times. New Century, 15 times. New American Standard, 13 times hell was mentioned. Messenger, 56 times hell was mentioned. Man, they outdid the King James, didn't they? English Standard, 14 times. The Living Bible, 19 times hell was mentioned. Now let's move down to the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament printed in Greek for right around 250 BC for the Jewish people that lived in Greece. The Septuagint, 0 times hell was mentioned. The Concordant Literal, 0 times. Complete Jewish Bible, 0 times. Young's translation, 0 times. The World English Bible, 0 times. Now, there's such that inconsistency, just that alone, that hard evidence of the inconsistency of that says something is wrong and something is not true with hell being in any Bible. And it requires research. I would like to encourage Christian, if Christians are viewing this, I'd like to encourage you. Don't you want to know why? Okay? Don't be afraid to ask why. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to find out. Seriously. Even though I was a little bit intimidated when I was researching this. Now let's continue with two more of It's in the Bible. My evidence. Death and or grave, okay, was translated as death and or grave in all of the Bibles that mentions hell. It was translated as death and or grave in all those Bibles mentioning hell when it pertained to a believer or just someone in general if you didn't know if they were a believer or not. However, it mysteriously was changed to the word hell. Death and grave was changed to the word hell whenever it was referring to an unbeliever. Now, if you can't see the lack of consistency in just translation, it's I believe a child could see the difference, that there's something askew here, wrong with this testimony. Alrighty? Now, last but not least, at least in this video of It's in the Bible, the Bible itself has no record of a creation of hell. So you're asking this court to believe that a place where countless billions are going to spend an eternity is less important for God to notify us about than bugs, fish, and birds? Okay? I hope that sinks in just a little bit. Now, in closing, the Roman, I could bring mounds of history books into that wouldn't contradict each other at all into a courtroom and point out how the Roman Empire was never conquered, yet it morphed and it collapsed and it changed into something entirely different than what it was before. So instead of Caesars running the show, the leadership became pontiffs and popes. Religion and government and politics became one at that time. All right? So now rather than controlling people with armies and governing them with laws of the Roman Senate and things like that, spiritual fear became the tool of choice here, folks. Because history tells us that the private army of the church enforced what people were allowed to believe or not believe. Now, the next step for this government, okay, or the church at that time, was to print and publish a unifying document, manuscript, book in 440 AD called the Latin Vulgate. Now, one might ask, well, how could a book unify people? Well, you got to understand that the vast majority of the Latins back then, the peasants, they couldn't read. They couldn't read or write. All right, so it was pretty easy to capitalize on their ignorance. The Latin culture already had a pagan superstition of a torment awaiting them in the underworld, you know. So the government and, like I said, the church at that time, they capitalized on their ignorance and their superstition. And in that Latin Vulgate, they inserted the word hell 111 times where it was non-existent before. It was non-existent in the Greek manuscripts and the letters that were used to actually produce the Latin Vulgate. Okay, I hope this is making sense, and I hope I've enticed you to research this for yourself. And this is only part one. Part 2 video, I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to talk about these testimonies of people who say they've been to hell, and the justice issue of why you might think people deserve to be there, you know. So I hope you tune in for part 2. Thank you for viewing.